One empty house would create the fullest classroom in America, and Ellen DeGeneres was about to discover why. The Ellen DeGeneres Show was buzzing with its characteristic warmth at the Warner Brothers studio in Burbank. Ellen stepped onto the stage wearing her signature white button-down and navy blazer, her infectious smile immediately connecting with the audience of 300 who rose to their feet in enthusiastic applause. The familiar studio atmosphere embraced everyone present, with its iconic blue sky backdrop dotted with white clouds and swaying palm trees, while the famous white chairs with their sleek black wooden legs awaited another afternoon of inspiring conversation. "Welcome back, everybody," Ellen called out as the opening music faded, her voice carrying that perfect combination of energy and genuine warmth that had made her show a beacon of positivity for nearly 2 decades. Today I want to share a story with you that's going to change the way you think about dedication, about loneliness, and about how sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones we never planned to have. Behind the scenes, the production team moved with their usual precision, cameras rolling smoothly as the show continued its well-oiled rhythm of human connection and emotional storytelling. It was Tuesday afternoon, and the studio hummed with the anticipation that preceded Ellen's most meaningful segments. In the green room, 67-year-old Margaret Thompson sat quietly, her silver hair neatly arranged and her hands folded over a worn leather portfolio that contained 3.5 decades of memories. Margaret had taught 5th grade at Lincoln Elementary School in suburban Denver for 35 years, and she had just retired 3 months ago. But what made Margaret's story extraordinary wasn't the length of her career, it was what she had done every single day after the final bell rang and the last school bus pulled away from the curb. For 35 years, Margaret had been the last person to leave Lincoln Elementary every single day. Not because she was required to stay, not because she was paid overtime, but because going home meant returning to an empty house that felt more like a reminder of everything she didn't have than a place of comfort and belonging. Margaret had never married, never had children of her own. It hadn't been a conscious choice. Life simply hadn't unfolded that way. She had focused on her education, then her career, always believing that love and family would come eventually. But the years had passed, and somewhere along the way, Margaret had accepted that she would live her life differently than she had once imagined. But what began as a way to avoid an empty house had evolved into something far more meaningful than Margaret could have anticipated. Those extra hours at school, initially filled with lesson planning and grading papers, had gradually transformed into something extraordinary. Margaret had become the unofficial after-hours mother to any child who needed one. It had started small. A few students whose parents worked late shifts and couldn't pick them up right at dismissal. Margaret would let them stay in her classroom, helping them with homework while they waited. Then came the children who struggled academically. Margaret began offering free tutoring sessions. Soon word spread among parents that Mrs. Thompson's classroom was a safe haven. Over the decades, Margaret's after-hours classroom had become legendary at Lincoln Elementary. Students would arrive as early as 6 a.m., knowing that Mrs. Thompson would already be there with hot cocoa and a listening ear. They would stay as late as 7 p.m., working on projects, getting homework help, or simply having a safe place to be when home wasn't the refuge it should have been. Margaret had helped children through their parents' divorces, celebrated birthdays for kids whose families had forgotten, provided meals for students who went hungry on weekends, and offered countless hours of emotional support to young people who desperately needed an adult to believe in them. She had attended graduations, weddings, and helped former students through college applications years after they had left her classroom. What Margaret didn't realize was that while she thought she was simply avoiding an empty house, she had actually created the fullest, most loving classroom in the entire school district. Her family included not just the 30 students officially on her roster each year, but the hundreds of additional children who had found their way to her classroom door over 3.5 decades. The revelation that had brought Margaret to Ellen's attention had occurred at her retirement party. What was supposed to be a small gathering had grown into a massive celebration that filled the entire school gymnasium. More than 800 former students had shown up, spanning 3 generations of families Margaret had touched. But the moment that had reduced Margaret to tears and captured the attention of local news outlets came when her former students presented her with a surprise that no one, including Margaret, had seen coming. They had created a video montage featuring hundreds of testimonials from people whose lives Margaret had changed, but they had organized it in a way that told a story Margaret had never understood about herself. The video began with Margaret's first students from 1987, now adults with children of their own. One by one, they shared stories of how Mrs. Thompson had stayed late to help them, had been the stable adult presence they needed during difficult times. Each decade revealed the same pattern. Margaret Thompson had been far more than a teacher. She had been a mother figure, a mentor, a source of unconditional love for countless children. But the most powerful moment in the video came when one of her former students, now a successful doctor, made a statement that changed everything. "Mrs. Thompson, you always said you never had a family of your own, but you were wrong. You had the biggest family in our entire town. You were our school mom, our safe place, our proof that someone cared about us. Your house might have been empty, but our hearts were full because of you." The gymnasium had erupted in applause as hundreds of former students stood and chanted, "Thank you, Mom Thompson," a nickname Margaret had never known they used for her behind her back. In that moment, Margaret realized that while she had spent 35 years thinking she was avoiding loneliness, she had actually been building the most extensive family network in her community. A production assistant appeared at Margaret's side. "Mrs. Thompson, you're up in just a minute. Are you ready?" Margaret looked down at the portfolio in her hands, which contained just a small sampling of the letters, drawings, and photographs she had received from students over the years. "As ready as I'll ever be," she said softly. Even after 3 months of retirement, she still couldn't quite believe that her simple habit of staying late at school had created something so meaningful. "Please welcome Margaret Thompson," Ellen announced, and Margaret walked onto the stage to warm applause. The audience immediately embraced this dignified woman who carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades nurturing young minds. Ellen could see immediately why children would have been drawn to Margaret. There was something inherently safe and welcoming about her presence. "Hi, Margaret," Ellen said warmly as they settled into the iconic white chairs. "Thank you so much for being here. I understand you just retired after 35 years of teaching 5th grade." "That's right," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the clear diction of someone accustomed to making sure children understood every word. 35 wonderful years at Lincoln Elementary School in Denver. And I also understand that you had a pretty amazing retirement party," Ellen prompted with a knowing smile. Margaret's face lit up with a mixture of amazement and joy. "It was incredible. I thought it would be a small gathering with my fellow teachers, but it turned into something I never could have imagined. More than 800 people came, former students, their parents, even grandchildren of my earliest students. The studio audience murmured with appreciation, clearly moved by the scope of Margaret's impact. "Tell me about your teaching style," Ellen said. "What made your classroom special?" Margaret thought for a moment. "Well, I suppose it wasn't just what happened during regular school hours. I always stayed late, much later than the other teachers. At first it was because I didn't have anywhere else to be. My house was empty, and school felt more like home to me than home did." Ellen leaned forward with interest. "What did you do during those extra hours?" "Initially just lesson planning and grading," Margaret said. "But gradually, children started staying late too. Some because their parents couldn't pick them up right at dismissal, others because they needed extra help with their schoolwork. Before I knew it, I was running an unofficial after-school program. How many children are we talking about? Over 35 years? Margaret's eyes widened slightly. I never kept an exact count, but based on my retirement party, I'd estimate I worked with over 1,000 children beyond my regular classroom students. Some stayed for an hour after school, others came early in the morning, some needed academic help, others just needed someone to listen to them. Ellen was clearly moved by the scope of Margaret's dedication. Margaret, you never married or had children of your own, did you? Margaret's expression grew softer, tinged with old sadness, but also newfound understanding. No, I didn't. For many years, that was my greatest regret. I always felt like I had missed out on the most important part of life, having a family. But it sounds like you did have a family, Ellen said gently. A very large one. That's what my students told me at the retirement party, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. They made a video, and one of my former students, he's a doctor now, told me that I was wrong about never having a family. He said I had been their school mom, their safe place. Ellen reached over and placed her hand on Margaret's arm. What was it like to realize that you had been a mother to so many children without even knowing it? Margaret wiped her eyes. Overwhelming. All these years I thought I was just staying busy to avoid going home to an empty house. But these children taught me that my house was empty because my real family was at school. I was going home to the wrong place every night. Ellen felt tears forming in her own eyes. Margaret, I understand you brought some things from your students. Can you share something with us? Margaret carefully opened her portfolio and pulled out a letter that was clearly well worn from being handled many times. This is from a student I had 20 years ago. Her name is Sarah, and she's now a teacher herself, partly because of what she experienced in my classroom. Margaret began to read. Dear Mrs. Thompson, I don't know if you remember me, but you saved my life when I was 10 years old. My parents were getting divorced, and I was angry and scared all the time. You let me stay in your classroom every day after school, and you never asked questions. You just let me be safe with you. You helped me with my homework, but more than that, you showed me what it felt like to have someone who cared. Because of you, I became a teacher. Because of you, I know how to recognize when a child needs extra love. You gave me a mother's heart when I needed it most. The studio was completely silent except for the soft sounds of people crying. Ellen wiped her eyes, completely moved by the pure love expressed in this former student's words. Margaret, Ellen said, her voice thick with emotion, do you understand what you've done? You've been a mother to children who needed exactly what you had to give. You haven't missed out on family. You've created a family that spans generations. Margaret nodded through her tears. I'm beginning to understand that. At my retirement party, I met children of my former students, and they told me their parents had talked about me their whole lives. Some of them are teachers now because of what they experienced in my classroom. Ellen stood up and moved to sit directly next to Margaret. Your empty house wasn't a symbol of what you didn't have. It was the reason you were available to give so much to others. She turned to address the camera directly. Ladies and gentlemen, this woman spent 35 years thinking she didn't have a family, when in reality she was building one of the largest, most loving families in her community. She proved that motherhood isn't about biology. It's about showing up, caring, and making children feel valued. The audience rose to their feet in spontaneous applause, recognizing that they were in the presence of someone who had lived out the truest definition of selfless love. Ellen looked back at Margaret. What are you doing in retirement? Funny you should ask, Margaret said with a smile. 3 of my former students are now teachers themselves, and they've asked me to volunteer in their classrooms. Apparently, they want their students to meet Grandma Thompson. Ellen laughed through her tears. So your family keeps growing? Every day, Margaret said with wonder in her voice. I spent so many years thinking I was missing out on the joys of family life, but I wasn't missing anything. I was just experiencing it in a different way than I expected. The episode aired exactly as it happened, becoming one of the most emotionally powerful segments in Ellen Show history. Within hours, Check Her School Mom Thompson was trending worldwide as viewers shared their own stories of teachers who had gone above and beyond to provide love and support. But the real impact came from the teaching community itself. Margaret's story inspired educators around the world to recognize the profound influence they have on children's lives, even when that influence extends far beyond traditional classroom hours. 6 months later, Margaret returned to Ellen's show with an update that brought even more joy. She had officially started a nonprofit program called Extended Family Teachers that helped connect educators with students who needed additional support. The program had spread to 12 states. "Any regrets about spending so many years thinking you didn't have a family?" Ellen asked during the follow-up interview. "None at all," Margaret said with a peaceful smile. "I've learned that the best families aren't always planned. Sometimes they just grow around you when you're not paying attention, when you're just focused on loving the people in front of you. Because sometimes the most beautiful families are formed not through marriage certificates or birth announcements, but through the daily choice to open your heart to children who need love, guidance, and the assurance that someone believes in them." Margaret Thompson had spent 35 years avoiding an empty house, never realizing that she was building the fullest classroom in America, one student at a time. In a television studio that day, an empty house became a symbol of abundance, and a retired teacher became proof that the greatest families are often the ones we never planned to have, but chose to love anyway.